Hello, my name is Dr. Wayne Sedlak, and this is our second in the series on the uniqueness of Memorial Day. The day itself brings up a long-held problem in the churches. Think about it for a moment. The alleged contradiction, and note I said alleged. The alleged contradiction between the Christian faith and its call to peace and the idea of honoring those who've gone to war and, to be frank, in most instances, not only put their lives on the line, but had to take the lives of their enemy combatants. Is that a contradiction? Are we honoring the memory of those who perhaps contradicted the very tenets of the Christian faith? Our forefathers didn't believe so, and neither did the early church. Something we pursued, of course, in our first in this story of Memorial Day. What it really represented, the uniqueness of the day. Well, we're going to look at that issue. Is there a contradiction when we say that Memorial Day is a day where we honor those who have lost their lives, but also in the process, before doing that, had to take the lives of others? Is that a contradiction? Let's see if that's the case. As I just said, it seems almost contradictory to say that our soldiers are trained to maintain the peace of a way of life. Note that. Soldiers maintaining the peace of a way of life. To do that, of course, at times they have to fire upon and kill enemy combatants. You can see here the issue of peace. Look at the graveyard. Those that have died for their country. Were they truly pursuing peace? You know, there are many in the churches historically, and I'm sure you've heard it at some time from someone, that, look, Christians aren't allowed to kill. After all, the Sixth Commandment says so. Not exactly. The Hebrew of the Old Testament does not say thou shalt not kill. The PL stem, and that's a verb form of the word kill, actually means thou shalt do no murder. But is that, I believe that should be enough to answer the question, but is that really enough for most who take this to be a contradiction to Christianity? Some would allege that the early church believed in pacifism. Hence, many Christians would not serve in the Roman armies in particular. Well, we're about to see in a moment there was not a contradiction. And the early church did not necessarily believe in pacifism. They had pretty much the same proportion of people as in the churches today. Some believed that you could not take up arms under any circumstances, and others believed that you did. However, in the Roman legions, in which the Christian church, we have the best records of the church's participation in this discussion, and many Christians who did become legionnaires, did become Roman soldiers to defend their countrymen. The issue was not defending their countrymen and their country. The issue was the way in which they'd be paid. Roman soldiers were paid with the spoil, the plunder of the nearby countryside after they win a battle. And Christians can't do that. So Christians reconciled the idea, as John the Baptist said, of the soldiers that he baptized. He said, be content with your wages. He did not say, stop, do not go off to war. He said, be content with your wages. And that's what the early church pretty much resolved upon. Hence, the famous unit, the Thundering Legion, mostly made up of Christians in the days of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and many other testimonies of the early church. But let's get back to the issue. History is a subordinate study to the scriptures themselves. So what about peace? Is it contradictory? Is Memorial Day kind of a slap in the face, as some would allege, to the Christian notion of peace? I believe, in fact, I'm going to assert it most certainly is not. Let's go back. You can see you see the preacher of the colonial era, portrait of the Black Regiment. Note his black robes. The Black Regiment, when I did the original paper on the Black Regiment in the 1980s, actually a study that extended from the 1970s, the Black Regiment was that name given by the British to those men in the pulpit with their black robes who admonished the colonists against oppression and against tyranny. But in studying the sermons of the Black Regiment and of many other pastors of the day, in the days leading up to the War for Independence, the emphasis wasn't so much upon oppression. I mean, yes, it was as you approach the war itself, the time of independence. But the emphasis was upon sin and righteousness. The sin of the people who for so long had turned their backs on the Lord, and righteousness, bringing that word back into the vocabulary of the church. In need, I believe, for today's churches. We talk a lot about love and peace, but we don't talk about righteousness as much. Righteousness, not just that which is imputed to us. That's certainly the key to a justifying faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. But also righteousness in the precepts we are called to obey and therein to walk by God's grace. The Black Regiment taught the people that they must not be overcome by sin, nor do their rulers, especially the royal governors of the various colonies, installed by the King of England to do his bidding, nor by the king or parliament itself. And by the way, parliament had no jurisdiction. Uniquely, with respect to the colonies, parliament had no jurisdiction over the colonies because they were chartered. And that's a whole subject in itself. However, it usurped authority. And that usurpation, and usurpation being a function of conquest and deceit, going beyond the vows, going beyond the Constitution of England, the laws of England, I should say, and especially in violation of the charters, the Black Regiment began to decry the sins, both of the nation and the oppressions, deceits of the magistrates, those of Parliament and King and royal governors. The Black Regiment were among those ministers that easily reconciled the fact that God has called us not to be overcome by sin, and to honor the soldier if his purpose is to defend against conquest, rape, murder, to defend his countrymen from those excesses, and of course, the tyranny that begets that kind of plundering spirit, those kinds of acts. General Douglas MacArthur once made the statement, duty, honor, country. Those three, and please note this, those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, and what you will be. You notice that the American soldier, sailor, and other personnel, those of the armed forces, according to the great general, are called upon to institute, to execute, to achieve the principles contained in three hallowed words, words that are sacred, and to those words that reverently dictate the formation of character. Duty, honor, and country were themes that had substance historically filled by the pulpits. The Black Regiment often spoke of duty and gave it a sense of love. From our Lord's words, for example, greater love is no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Honor, that necessary attribute of character that upholds principle and walks in it, and will not violate it readily or unwittingly. Country, love for your neighbor, love for the people whom God has given you. We need to stop talking about man to man only. The sermons that I saw back in the late 1970s when I had access to the sermons that were on, they were on microfiche in that day, hundreds of them that were preserved from our colonial era and in the first 2 decades, especially, of the young United States as well, often used these terms, duty, honor, and country, as operations or functions of the soul committed to the fear of the Lord. And these words are, in fact, found in Scripture. Loving your neighbor, upholding the standard of uprightness, honor, and the courage, the duty, to stand for that which is right, good, and we should add, represents your love for your neighbor and especially to your God. These are the things soldiers were taught in our colonial churches. The Black Regiment emphasized this. Well, so it wasn't first and foremost opposition to a king and parliament and no taxation without representation. Two, that was there. But it was mostly about sin and righteousness and the duty to stand for a standard of uprightness which would distinguish the colonists in general and soldiers who would go to war. And remember, we were not a warlike people. Our spirit was not to be a conquering people, and the pulpits had all they could do to keep that beast tamed in the hearts of people. Obviously, excesses on the frontier and on the open seas. Our forefathers and the pulpits knew that the idea of vengeance and even of plunder could overwhelm men as they went to war, as they realized that the only thing that stood between them and any order on a frontier was a musket. That's not much. So it took character. You can see in this partial portrait that we have of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important aspects of the soldier in America is represented herein. The Declaration of Independence is being pictured as for the signatories of those magistrates who put their name by oath to a document that represented a doctrine from the Black Regiment, a doctrine preached upon for years and understood actually for over a century in America. It took the name, the interposition of the lesser magistrate. I saw that too in the sermons in the late 70s and began to preach it myself in the late 70s and all through the 1980s. Hence the original position paper that I was able to pen back in the 1980s and revised in 1993 called the Black Regiment, also called, by the way, the Black Robe Regiment. You see that they are signing a document, the Declaration of Independence, that represents the lesser magistrates. It's a doctrine that says that everyone who holds a position, from the king, parliament, governors, legislators, senators, right on down, every magistrate, including the police and the soldier, take an oath. That oath, by oath, they are sworn to uphold, maintain, and defend, and of course now, the Constitution of the United States, and in our case here in this state, the Constitution of Wisconsin. Back then, it was to uphold their colonial charters. But most importantly, it was an oath that they took, which they were not allowed to exceed, but there was an addition to that. You see, if the upper magistrate, the king, the royal governor, the parliament, if the so-called upper magistrate or higher magistrate violated his oath to protect the people, to uphold justice, maintain the standard of uprightness, and service to a people, if that's violated, then it became the duty of lesser magistrates, which is what these men were. They were appointed and sent to the Second Continental Congress. They represented their colonies. These are magistrates, lesser magistrates. And they signed a document resisting the unrighteousness, the criminal conduct of those in authority above them, namely king, parliament, and royal governors in particular. The lesser magistrate is sworn never to violate the Constitution into which he is placed by oath. That's become and has always been the soldier's calling. Now, back in Vietnam, rather reeling up to the more modern era, in this case, the war in Vietnam, Lieutenant Kelly was charged with having murdered 22 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. He claimed that his superiors had given the order, and therefore he ordered the 22 people, unarmed people, massacred at My Lai. The My Lai massacre, as it's called, drew a court-martial. Lieutenant Kelly was, in fact, found guilty. Now, saying that his superiors ordered it was not accepted as a defense. You note that? He's a soldier under oath. And I want to say that that distinguishes Memorial Day. All of our soldiers, sailors, armed forces are men and women under oath. They may not obey a superior, even the president, when they're commanded to violate the content of their oath, namely the Constitution of the United States. Same with police. To do so is to become criminal, as Lieutenant Kelly, when he was court-martialed for murder. So you can see ours is a unique system. The soldier, the policeman, the sailor, all those in the armed forces are called to represent the oath-bound testimony of their own office. Yes, they obey their superiors. They go into battle. And many have died out of love for their countrymen. But understand, they're bound by oath, nonetheless, to protect us. Our rights, that includes our rights, our freedoms, our callings under the Constitution. If they violate that right, they're criminal. And since they got the power, the badge, the gun, the uniform, by virtue of the oath to the Constitution, they can't change their mind later or say that they were ordered contrary to it. No governor, for example, no president, no Congress, even if Congress writes a law contrary to the Constitution, if it is indeed contrary to the Constitution, it is null and void. It's supposed to be struck down by the judiciary. If judges judge fraudulently, their judgments can be, in fact, voided. Now, our soldiers knew that historically. Our forefathers were taught that. In the picture, if you were to look between the two sets of men standing and look right through that, shall we call that gap or that little valley, in the background, seated are four men. One to the right is the Reverend John Witherspoon. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was also, and can be described as, our forefathers' mentor. Men like George Washington sought his counsel regularly, as did others, many others. He understood this issue of the oath. In fact, he was an expert on the scriptures and the duties requisite for the soldier, as well as, in general, the stand taken against the higher magistrates. Here you see in the portrait, well, carved in stone, Washington, Thomas Jefferson in particular, two of our forefathers who were counseled by John Witherspoon. In fact, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence represents the inner position of the lesser magistrate. That's why it has, from biblical doctrine taught by Witherspoon and other men of the Black Regiment, that's why it has validity. The scriptures teach inner position because God does not allow any magistrate to violate holiness, the sacredness of his oath, and perpetrate criminal acts. King George III was one of those tyrants. You can see him here pictured, and here again in this caricature, 1786 of the King George III, using money given him from the treasury for his own personal debts. Our forefathers reacted against that kind of usurpation and fraud. That's one of the reasons, not the only reason, they stood against the king. George Washington was, of course, our great forefather, a great leader and a Christian man, especially later on in life. The tenets of the Christian faith came home to him, particularly in the years of his public duty. He was called the Joshua of America. Yes, that was his common name. Known throughout the newspapers and throughout the colonies, he was called that. Why is that? Let's take a look for a moment from the scriptures. We're told that Joshua commanded the sun to be still when he needed more, to be quite frank, daylight to defeat the enemies that he was embattled, with whom he was embattled there in Canaan. So Joshua commanded the sun to be still, and it was. And his enemies then could be defeated. At the Treaty of Paris, 1783, Benjamin Franklin represented the United States. The ambassadors, both in France and England, were there. The Treaty of Paris recognized the young country, the United States, for the first time as a free and independent nation. And so there was a toast at the conclusion of the festivities where the ambassador for England stood up and he toasted King George III, the King of England, whom he compared to as the sun, S-U-N, sun in the heavens. Not to be outdone, his rival, the French, of course they were enemies, the ambassador of France, who did very much do the bidding of George Washington as an ally. The ambassador for France stood up and he toasted the King of France, comparing him to the moon that shines forth in the darkness. Then Benjamin Franklin stood up and with a smile on his face, he raised his glass and said to George Washington, the Joshua of America, who commanded the sun and the moon to be still, and they obeyed. We would go on to fight the British yet again in the open seas in the War of 1812, and miraculously, you might say, the young nation, for the second time in a generation, defeated the most powerful nation on earth, Great Britain. Lex de Tocqueville commented on that and said, it was in fact miraculous for a young nation like that to twice defeat Great Britain, which his own country, France, had failed to do 4 or 5 separate times over the previous century and a half, was a marvel. He ascribed it not to the warlike propensities of the Americans, but rather to their faith. Faith in Jesus Christ. Our soldiers have fought tyrants. You, of course, recognize this one. Adolf Hitler and his Nazis, the National Socialists, the kind of oppressors that need to be stopped. These are people that do not dialogue. Americans, especially in the church, have to realize that peace does not mean we always must talk things through no matter what. There are some individuals that do not talk, or at least they won't dialogue once they realize you're onto them. Adolf Hitler was one. The Nazi symbol represented long since, a centuries long, a cult symbol. The Nazis and Hitler were indeed Satanists. They were spiritists, involved with contact with the dead. And you can see the results at Auschwitz, the bodies. Now that's what happens when we think we can appease tyrants. You can't dialogue with tyrants. Our soldiers at some point must be sent into the fray because tyrants like Hitler won't listen. And often dialoguing means we take the first blow, as it was with the Japanese, who surprised us and killed thousands at Pearl Harbor. So you see, dialogue has a price. And the soldier then, the American soldier, must become the one to stand in the gap to keep it from happening, well, to keep our people protected against these kinds of evils. Memorial Day had its origin out of the grief surrounding the Civil War. The New School Presbyterian Synod of Wisconsin, September of 1872, actually it was 1862, wrote, whereas a fearful civil war still continues to rage with increasing intensity, these United States, and by its falling victims, bringing grief and mourning to a multitude of homes. It went on then to decry the fact that the church had failed to keep and to guard the nation. And so we find Lincoln saying the same thing throughout, especially the latter years of his rule, calling for the churches to again become the guardian of the republic, which they had failed to achieve in the years in the run-up to the Civil War. That's what our soldiers must represent. The churches, calling a people under righteousness, being the guardians of the republic. So to those who gave their lives, to those who serve today, we here at Vision Viewpoint thank you for your courage and your sacrifice. May God bless